Picture this, it's 2007 in Iraq, and you're in the middle of a firefight. Bullets are whizzing by left and right, the enemies are reckless, hopping out of cover and spraying bullets at you, as though they didn't expect you to fire back. It's hectic and chaotic, but thanks to heavy firepower and superior tactics, you and your buddies manage to take them out. When you go over to the building the insurgents had made into their base, among their belongings you find a bag of white pills. You've never seen this type of pressed pill before, I hope. You pour out the bag and look closer. It's the Middle East's favorite stimulant, Captagon. Today we're not just telling the story of Captagon, but how it made Syria under Bashar al-Assad, which I believe is how you're supposed to say his name, forgive me I don't speak Arabic, a narco state, and the crime bosses who profited from it. Let's get into it.
Charlie Dogwood.
Like many illegal substances, Captagon started out as something legal. It was used for children with ADHD, but by the 1970s, the drug had begun to be abused since it's very closely related to methamphetamine. By 1987, all legal production of the substance had ceased, but by then it was too late. The Middle East had gotten a taste for the drug. Captagon was originally, it seems, primarily a party drug, though later on it would be used very differently. Starting in the 1980s and into the 1990s, in parts of the Middle East, among those with money and connections, Captagon gained some prominence, especially in countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. However, this was not really Captagon. Captagon is very easy and very inexpensive to make, apparently, but in the Middle East, most of the Captagon was heavily cut with either caffeine, ephedrine, or even quinine. The actual purity of Captagon changed over the years, but by the 1990s it had a stable market share of the Middle Eastern drug trade. Part of this demand probably comes from the Lebanese Civil War. Now if I described the Lebanese Civil War, we'd be here all day. The point is, Lebanon, which is a very religiously diverse country, had a very violent civil war starting in 1975. It ended in 1990, but the Syrians occupied part of the country until 2005. During this civil war, Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shiite militia group, also came into prominence and was one of the few militia from the civil war to remain really active after the civil war. Part of the area that Syria occupied was the Bekaa Valley, which is one of Lebanon's most important farming regions. It's also a major site of marijuana growing and has been the site of the nation's hashish and even opium industries since the civil war. While the opium trade had died out, the marijuana trade there in the valley remained strong until Syria acted under American pressure and bulldozed the marijuana fields in the early 1990s. This was Syria's first taste of the drug game under the patriarch Hafez al-Assad, and from marijuana alone he made something like $500 million a year back in the 70s and 80s. But Hafez was rolling in cash back then and he didn't really need the income. It was only about 20 years after that the situation would be totally turned on its head. Since the 1963 coup, Syria had been led by the Ba'ath Party and its Alawite-dominated leadership. Alawites are an offshoot of Shiism and are concentrated around Syria's Mediterranean coast. They're about 11% of Syria's population, but since 1963, they had increasingly held more and more power to the detriment of the Sunni Muslim majority. One of those Alawites was Hafez al-Assad, who seized power in a coup in 1970. Hafez would have 6 children with his wife Anissa Makhlouf, a daughter who died when she was an infant, his other daughter Bushra, who had a strong personality, his eldest son Basil, a horse-riding dynamo with brains to match. He was set to be the heir of his father. However, when Basil drove into a barrier one day at high speeds, he died instantly. Then there was the second son, Bashar. Bashar was shy and geeky, having been sent off to London to study medicine before his older brother's passing. Since 1994, he had been the heir. Then there was Majd, who had a mental health problem and was not considered for succession. Then last, but definitely not least, there was Maher. Unlike Basil, the Golden Knight, and Bashar, the quiet nerd, Maher was violent and quick to anger. In fact, it's rumored that he shot his own brother-in-law in a fit of rage. He would make a good enforcer, but never a good leader for Syria. After Hafez's death in 2000, there was a brief controversy over succession, but in the end, Bashar was made the president of Syria. Bashar's governing style was odd, and he tried to play both sides. He began market reforms and had allowed the CIA to set up black sites in Syria. But he had also engaged in a series of terrorist attacks in Lebanon, tried to continue his own nuclear program that Israel ended up blowing up, and even violated the 2003 Iraq War sanctions to help Syria's old enemy, Iraq. In 2005, the Syrian occupation of Lebanon ended, and one of the major power players in the country, the pro-Iranian Shiite militia Hezbollah, was looking for more and more cash. They had a lot of enemies. So, some of the leadership began to focus on producing a drug called Captagon around 2006. One of the areas that they did this in was in one of Lebanon's most important farming regions, the Bekaa Valley, which was also partly under their control. That area sitting alongside the Syria-Lebanon border was a major region for smuggling, and since Syria left in 2005, it had once again become a center for cannabis and now even Captagon production. For insurgents, Captagon is like cocaine in Latin America. It offers a good way of not just making money, but also a good way to pep up the soldiers. Some even called Captagon the jihad drug for its prevalence among insurgents, valuing it for its ability to make soldiers dull to pain and void of fear. However, Captagon smuggling was controversial inside Hezbollah, so the organization cracked down on it. Regardless, the pathways and markets for Captagon have been opened up. For a number of years, Hezbollah and Syria had a good relationship. Since 2005, Hezbollah have been part of a pro-Syrian March 8th alliance. So it's likely then that some level of Captagon smuggling had begun to originate inside of Syria, heading towards Iraq, with the intent of hurting the US. By around 2006, whatever goodwill Syria had built up with the US had been burnt up. In 2011, when street vendor Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, the whole of the Middle East erupted into revolution, and Syria could not avoid it. Mass protests against al-Assad broke out all over Syria. But unlike countries where the population could easily rally around the anti-corruption and pro-reform message that led to the collapse of the Tunisian and Egyptian governments, the al-Assad family could rely on demographics. These religious and ethnic divides allowed the mass protest period of the Syrian Revolution to turn into massacres of protesters by the hundreds. By June of 2011, there were routine battles between the government and foreign-supported rebels. The Syrian civil war had begun, and there was nothing left stopping it. The hardline approach employed by the al-Assad regime, likely partly influenced by Maher al-Assad, isolated the regime and inflamed the revolutionaries, making them even more radical. Peace was now impossible. Sanctions piled onto the regime, and the already broken economy of Syria collapsed under the civil war and sanctions put in place by the West. Bashar and Maher had sleepwalked into civil war with a broken economy and a broken army. Only Russian and Iranian aid and intervention could keep the regime from collapsing. As each day went forward, Syria became in need of more and more cash. They were desperate for anything to get hard currency, so they began to look into their Captagon industry, growing it further and further to fund the war that they had gotten themselves into. Captagon became one of the ways for the regime to fund itself. Maher al-Assad used a relative of his, Hassan al-Assad, to be the middleman for the operation in Lebanon. Wassim reached out to Lebanese drug lords to help increase production and smuggling capabilities. Wassim met two relatives, Nouh and Ali Zaiter. Nouh was born in the drug-fueled Bekaa Valley in the late 1970s, when the Lebanese civil war was just starting. It was in this violent atmosphere that they were raised, at least until Nouh fled to Switzerland in 1991. Nouh Zaiter would return to the Bekaa Valley in 1995, and from that day, the pair forged a family drug-running enterprise, focusing on marijuana and hashish, grown in the fertile fields of the Bekaa Valley. Given that the two were Shiites and were in Hezbollah terrain, the pair likely aligned, at least superficially, with Hezbollah. However, Ali Zaiter's origins are far murkier and far less is known about him in general. By the mid-2010s, the Zaiters were big enough in the drug game to move metric tons through Lebanon. In addition to the Zaiters, Wassim met with a smuggler named Hassan Muhammad Daqqou, who would flourish so greatly as a drug lord with the Syrians that he would become known as the King of Captagon. He had grown rich in the smuggling game, but once he joined up with the Syrians, Daqqou would amass a string of legal enterprises and properties in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, to hide and wash the vast sums of cash that he earned smuggling Captagon. It was these three men, the two Zaiters and Hassan Muhammad Daqqou, who would form the backbone of the Syrian-Lebanese Captagon connection. By 2016, a mere 4 years into the civil war, Captagon production in the Bekaa Valley would reach an estimated $1 billion in revenue. The Syrians would make even more money going through the port at Latakia and other routes. However, Captagon had gotten so popular and Maher's smuggling operations had gotten so good that police forces all over the world were capturing millions of pills at a time. So to give a brief rundown, here are just some of the captured shipments. November 2015, Turkish authorities seized 2 tons of Captagon produced in Syria. December 2015, the Lebanese army shut down 2 secret underground Captagon factories in Arsal, just northwest of the Bekaa Valley. That same month, the Lebanese police discovered 3 tons of Captagon and hashish that was going to be smuggled into Egypt. In 2021 alone, Saudi police seized more than 20 million tablets of Captagon. The smuggling just kept going on and on and on, all coming from Syria or subsidiaries of Maher in Lebanon. The situation had gotten so extreme that a Saudi prince, Prince Abdel Mohsen bin Walid bin it's a long ass name. Prince Abdul Mohsen bin Walid bin Abdul Aziz had gotten caught trying to smuggle 2 tons of Captagon from Lebanon to Saudi Arabia. He's lucky he was caught in Lebanon and not Saudi Arabia. Instead of getting his head chopped off, he was able to buy his freedom after a brief stint in a cushy jail cell. The Captagon business was booming. With Russian and Iranian assistance and a Captagon bankroll, the Assad regime was able to make major gains against the rebels. By December of 2017, ISIS was defeated, and the rebels were increasingly looking to be bottled up for al-Assad to deal with piecemeal. Maher was even made the official head of the elite 4th Armored Division, which he made into an integral part in the Captagon operation. Things were looking up for Damascus. It seemed like Bashar al-Assad was going to stay as the president of Syria. Syria remained internationally isolated and its economy was still in the dumps. So, Syria entered the Captagon Golden Age. Its Captagon exports were double its legal exports, and by 2023, the estimation of the Captagon trade was worth over double Syria's legal GDP. This was good news and bad news. On one hand, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, now the government was relying on the drug trade itself. Syria had become a narco-state, and the Lebanese gangsters were reaping the rewards for working with Damascus. The Zaiters and Daqqou were making money hand over fist, easily millions of dollars a year from Captagon alone. They had the connections to get the product, the smuggling lines to get it to where they needed it, and virtual immunity from Lebanon as long as they stayed in Syria. In fact, the situation got so good for them that Nouh Zaiter started to become a public figure with political power in his own right. While Nouh Zaiter had earlier in 2016 did an interview and freely admitted to dealing marijuana and hash, though of course denying any involvement in the Captagon trade, he reached an absurd level of power when he publicly encouraged protesters against the Lebanese government during the 2019 17th of October revolution. Here was this wanted criminal who had been in shootouts with the nation's military who was also somehow dipping his toes into public politics. He even opened up an Instagram account where he played the role of loving father and pious Muslim in spite of being a self-admitted drug lord. Ali Zaiter was totally different, by the way. He was almost totally invisible and even went by an assumed name, Abu Saleh. He had gained a reputation as one of the best Captagon cooks in Lebanon and was perhaps even more wealthy and powerful than Nouh Zaiter. In addition to drugs, Ali Zaiter took parts in kidnapping plots, even nabbing a Saudi national and forcing him to empty his bank account. However, that probably put him into the spotlight more than he wanted. Things got even better for the Zaiters in 2021. Lebanese authorities found a huge shipment of Captagon heading for Saudi Arabia and managed to connect Daqqou to it. Daqqou, it seems, wasn't as much of an outlaw as the Zaiters, so when the authorities came through looking for him, they were able to snag him and bring down his criminal empire with a single arrest. The Lebanese police were able to find over $3 million in his residence and at a construction company of his, and he openly claimed during the interrogation that he was working with the 4th Armored Division of Maher al-Assad to track drug smuggling in Syria, like he was a cop or something like that. He even showed them an official 4th Division ID card as if that was like, gonna get him off somehow. Daqqou was only given 7 years, and from behind bars he continued to run his drug empire, allegedly with the help of Hezbollah, but the arrest seriously damaged his prospects for the future. After that, the two Zaiters were there to pick up the pieces. Without a shot fired, the pair had become the dealers most deeply connected to Damascus now that Daqqou was no longer free. However, with every benefit, there was a cost. In 2021, Nouh Zaiter was sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment. His nephew and nephew's son were arrested in Kuwait, and not long after, one of Nouh Zaiter's sons was arrested in Lebanon. When you mixed the increased governmental pressure and the fact that Lebanon legalized marijuana growing for medicinal use in 2020, the Zaiters were in an odd situation. They were more powerful and more rich than they had ever been before. But just at this critical moment, the brief Captagon Golden Age was about to end. On the 24th of February, 2022, Russian troops charged over the border into Ukraine. The Russian charge to Kyiv failed, and Putin's planned 10-day war in Ukraine had become a multi-year-long slog. Syria was now ignored. Every ruble that the embattled Putin sent to Damascus was 1 ruble taken away from a war that could destroy everything that Putin had been building since 1999. After October 7th the following year, and the wider escalation of the Iran-Israeli conflict in the Middle East, now Iran didn't have as much time for Damascus either. Damascus's old ally, Hezbollah, was even on the receiving end of a beeper-based attack, and their leader, Nasrallah, went up in a puff of kosher missile smoke. With Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah all fighting for their lives, no one had time or money for little old Syria. Now the only thing funding the regime was small amounts of legal exports and whatever scraps of aid that they could manage to get from their friends, but mostly it was drugs. 2 months after Nasrallah's death in December of 2024, the rebels who had long been bottled up in the northwestern region of Idlib broke out, capturing Aleppo. After that, it was as though the Syrian military simply melted away. In under 2 weeks, the al-Assad regime had fallen. The al-Assad family then fled to Russia. Except for Wassim, they just kinda left him there. As prisoners were released after decades and the detailed files of the Syrian secret police were poured over by the rebels, an increasingly large amount of drugs and drug factories were being discovered. It was then that the full depth of the Syrian government's complicity in the drug trade was starting to come to light. Overnight, an estimated 90% of the Captagon traffic globally dried up, and the new Syrian government intended to keep it that way. For the Zaiters, everything that was bad that could have happened did. No Captagon supply, the marijuana and hash market totally disrupted, Hezbollah weaker than ever, and death sentences being handed down after in absentia trials in 2024. And even worse, no Syria to run to for safety. Now it was open season on the Zaiters. 2025 also proved to be the start of a major intensification of the Lebanese drug war, coincidentally. The Lebanese army raided the Bekaa Valley multiple times, and even raided the Palestinian camps in Lebanon where they seized drugs, weapons, and ammo. In August of 2025, Ali Zaiter and 2 other top drug dealers were blown away by a Lebanese military drone when they tried to escape. Just this past November, Nouh Zaiter was caught unaware while on a rural road and was arrested by the Lebanese military. The longtime loudmouth got handcuffed by the military without a single shot being fired. He's very likely to be executed, unless his money and influence can buy him a reprieve, which is possible. But today, even as we speak, the Captagon market still exists. Jihadis and Saudi party boys will still want the Captagon pills, and insurgents and terrorists will still want to try and produce and smuggle it. Gangsters still exist in Lebanon, and the drug war will continue. rogue governments can still create drug smuggling networks. For now, the Syrian Captagon industry is gone, and the Lebanese drug lords who worked with them are by and large dead or behind bars. But the drugs and the users remain. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video, and I hope you have a lovely 2025 holiday season. Also, feel free to check out my Twitch and Stream VOD channel. All links are in the description and you know what's next. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.